And welcome to the 26th meeting of the COVID-19 Committee. We have received apologies from Beatrice Wishart, MSP, who is attending another parliamentary committee. Can I welcome Liam MacArthur, MSP, to this meeting, who is a substitute for Beatrice. This morning, the committee will be taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell, MSP, and Professor Jason Leach, the National Clinical Director in the Scottish Government. This session gives members the opportunity to take evidence on this week's review of the levels restrictions. The committee will also consider the regulations arising from the First Minister's statement on Saturday, the 19th of December. Those regulations are entitled the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 8 Regulations 2020 SSI 2020/452. Cabinet Secretary, can I welcome you to the meeting, and can I invite you to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to attend the committee again. Due to the seriousness of the situation that we are currently facing, the First Minister announced the need for further restrictions on Saturday 19th December after a Cabinet meeting, with further clarification given in her statement to Parliament on the 22nd of December. These were in advance of and superseded the scheduled 7th review of the allocation of levels across Scotland under the strategic framework. While the situation in Scotland is not currently as severe as in other parts of the UK, the arrival of the new variant of the virus, for which the evidence suggests spreads substantially more quickly than the other strains that we have been dealing with so far. We know that the strain is already seeded in Scotland and circulating, albeit at a lower level than in other parts of the UK. As such, the Cabinet agreed for the need to take firm and decisive action to stop it from taking hold here. As you will be aware, the First Minister announced a number of measures in response. Firstly, Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles and the other relatively remote islands within Highland and Argyll and Bute that have seen restrictions relaxed in recent weeks will move to level 3 from Boxing Day. The rest of Scotland will move to level 4. These measures are justified, proportionate and necessary to mitigate the risks we are facing, but the First Minister has confirmed that they will be reviewed after 2 weeks. We will also be classifying essential retail more narrowly in legislation in order to limit interactions, meaning that, for example, homeware stores, garden centres will be required to close. Those in level 4 will also be encouraged to stay local and at home as much as possible. A strict travel ban between Scotland and the rest of the UK will now remain in place during the festive period. This is unfortunate but necessary. It is a necessary reduction of the festive bubble period to only extend to Christmas Day, and that has been brought into law. But our advice remains, of course, not to meet indoors if this can be avoided. Travel within Scotland for meeting with a bubble will also only be allowed on Christmas Day. The First Minister also announced the difficult decision to delay the start of the new school term. That will only now reopen from the 5th of January for the children of key workers and for particularly vulnerable children only. There will be similar arrangements for children using early learning and childcare services. For other pupils, school term will start on the 11th of January, but for the first week of term at least online. Can I now turn to the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 8 regulations? On Monday, the Scottish Government provided the committee with a copy of the regulations which were made on Sunday. These regulations implemented the changes announced by the First Minister on the 19th of December. We were required to make these regulations urgently, as travel to Northern Ireland for the festive period would have been permitted from the 22nd of December if no change had been made. The Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 9 Regulations 2020 are also for discussion. On Tuesday, the First Minister announced some changes to Level 4 in this respect, as I've said, of non-essential retail. Usually we would provide the committee with draft regulations so they can be considered in advance of making. Due to the change of timings this week, the regulations which make the change are still being finalised, so have not been shared in advance. I'm sorry about that. We plan to make and lay the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 9 regulations later today. These regulations will further restrict what is considered essential retail in Level 4. These businesses affected include homeware retailers, garden centres and travel agencies. Click and collect services will, however, still be available. The regulations will also require some retail showrooms, such as kitchen, bathroom, furniture or glazing showrooms, to close in Level 4 in response to feedback on enforcement difficulties. Our intention is also to prohibit travel to the Republic of Ireland in these regulations. This is due to the change in circumstances which has been seen a new national lockdown in Ireland on Tuesday. These regulations will be published later today. Convener, I hope the committee has found that brief outline helpful. Of course, I and Professor Jason Lees would be happy now to take.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that very helpful statements. Yesterday, the First Minister suggested that additional measures beyond level 4 may be necessary. Can either of you be more precise in terms of specific additional measures which may be taken in the near future? And what elements of these may become matters of regulation rather than simply guidance?
I think, Convener, before I pass to Jason Leach, who I think would want to give the reasons for this, because I think we should very much hear those reasons at an early stage. I think the First Minister was clear yesterday that the consideration has to be given to putting into regulation anything which will contribute to the reduction in the spread of the new variant. And I think she was very clear, and Jason Leach will no doubt amplify this, that if you have any new variant that may add, say, 0.4 to the R number, then it will be absolutely crucial to take those steps that try and mitigate against that, given that during the previous lockdown, we managed to R to 0.6. Anything that adds to it would be difficult. Now, obviously, during the previous lockdown, there were issues to do with distance you could travel from your home, and that might be an issue, but I don't think we want to speculate on any firming up of level 4, except to say we had better recognise how serious this is. I was very struck this week by something that Debbie Schroeder said, who was always saying, in my view, very important things. And she talked about the need to think about this as the actions we had to take collectively as a society in order to do this job, not just to think about how we could get exemptions to that. This wasn't about how we could work our way round the problem. It was about how we solve the problem. And that is a context in which we'll take it forward. But Jason, no doubt, will want to amplify the reasons for this and some of the things that can be done to limit its spread.
Yeah, thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you, Convener, for having me back again this morning. It does feel like a week or even 6 days is a long time in this pandemic since we last spoke. It may be helpful, actually, if I refer to the NERVTAG minutes. That may not be something I would conventionally do, but NERVTAG is the New and Emerging Viral Threat Committee for the whole of the UK, a committee that most of us didn't know existed until 11 months ago. It met on Friday to consider this new variant, and that was why we, Gregor and I, had conversations on Friday evening and then gave advice to the First Minister and the Cabinet on Saturday morning at an emergency Cabinet meeting. We don't do that lightly. And the minutes that are now publicly available and released say the growth rate from genomic data, which suggests a growth rate of this variant, it has a code number, that is 71% higher than other variants. And it has a confidence interval of 67 to 75%. Studies of correlation between R values and detection of this variant, which suggest an absolute increase in R of between 0.39, so 0.4, and 0.93, or 0.9. So they're suggesting that we can't be absolutely certain yet because we haven't had enough time, that R increases by 0.4 to 0.9. And then I think probably the most important bullet point in their minutes is unfortunately this one. It was noted that the code-numbered variant has demonstrated exponential growth during a period when national lockdown measures were in place. So that suggests that the November lockdown in the southeast of England wasn't sufficient to drive down the R number for this variant. Now, we don't know the absolute details of why that is. We don't know the absolute science behind why that is. We have ideas, we have theory, and we have some science about how the spike protein attaches to cells, about how it is more efficient at doing what it does, unfortunately. But it goes to your question. What else would you have to do? And the First Minister made it clear yesterday there were two immediate things she wanted to consider, one of which is done, which is redefining essential retail, non-essential retail, which Mr. Russell has just outlined. And the second is putting a stay-at-home message into guidance or into regulation. And that was the second thing she said was under consideration yesterday. But we will have to keep everything on the table. and we will monitor this variant over hours, days, weeks as time passes.
Thank you very much for that. My next question is about the new variant, and it's probably best directed to the National Clinical Director. But could you give us any updates on how prevalent the new strain is in Scotland? And secondly, is it reasonable to suggest that it might be sensible for the proportion of cases that contain the new variant to become an indicator or a criteria that local authorities perhaps report?
So I can tell you that as of yesterday, we believe about 14% in the last week have been this variant, and that has been increasing from 0, of course, some weeks ago, up to 14%, which is lower than the 60-odd% we're seeing in Kent and the east of England. The slightly tricky thing here is that you can't be sure until you do genomic sequencing. Genomic sequencing, Scotland and the UK does more of that than any other country in the world. So in reality, this variant is probably in other countries. Other countries have already reported it a little, but we do more genomics than anybody else. We will get more genomic data today on a new set of samples from the weekend and late last week. But we have a proxy measure, which is a little bit technical. But from the PCR testing looks for 3 genes, the S gene, the ORF gene, and the N gene. If it cannot find the S gene, that suggests it is this variant, but it is not definitive for it, but it's high probability. And that's how we are coming up with that 14% figure. We call it S gene dropout. It's a very technical thing about PCR testing. So it is here. It is particularly here in Lanarkshire and Greater Glasgow and Clyde. That makes sense. That's where the highest prevalence is. And that's why we have acted as quickly as we could to increase people's awareness, to increase the communication, to try and get people to do it. We will, Public Health Scotland will make these choices, of course. We will, over time, publish as much as we can about this variant, where it is, and what it's doing. That will be UK-wide, and Public Health Scotland will publish that for Scotland just as soon as we have that information. If it does what it has done down south, that will become a slightly moot point because it will become the dominant strain. The one that transmits most inevitably becomes the dominant strain. Of course it does. And it's important, I think, to reassure anybody who's watching that the other thing we now think is it doesn't give you a more severe disease. You are more likely to catch it, but it is just the same disease that you got before. So most people will recover, most people will have mild disease, but unfortunately, some, particularly elderly, will not have mild disease.
So in terms of it becoming an indicator, you wouldn't see the sense in doing that?
I think it will become a part of the puzzle, but I don't think it will look like one of the 5 indicators that you've got so used to looking at in the local authority list. I think it will become part of the decision-making, of course, but I don't think it will be, for example, in extremis. Dumfries and Galloway has 40% of the new variant and Orkney has none, therefore we're going to make different. I don't think it will be quite as specific as that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm now going to move to other members' questions, and we've got quite a strict time limit of about 8 minutes each per MSP. And if any member has supplementary questions, if we have time, we'll take them at the end. So can I turn, first of all, to the Deputy Convener, Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. If I can just stick with the issue of the levels of protection. If the evidence takes the advisors to a place where they have to say to ministers, look, we'll have to do more than level 4, we'll have to strengthen protections to keep people safe. What are the items that are at the top of the list in terms of maximum protection, the measures that would bring the R number down the most? Does that involve having more people working at home and more people learning from home? And if so, on the issue of learning, not just for school-aged children, but university, college too, what work is happening between now and the new year to make sure that appropriate contingencies can be in place?
I want to ask Jason particularly about work being done, because that is the key issue, and it's scientific work being done. But I want to also make it clear that any and all recommendations would be considered very seriously by the Cabinet, and are likely to be accepted by the Cabinet, with the objective, and I go back to this idea of objective, with the objective of driving the R number down, and driving it down in a way that means that the pandemic does not result in the overwhelming of our health services and more deaths. So I think Jason has repeated what I said earlier on and what the First Minister said, considering the issue of a stay-at-home message. Well, of course, eventually a stay-at-home message during previous period was a compulsory thing, and it was in regulation. And we're not there yet, but the First Minister indicated that's something that has to be seriously considered. There was also reporting yesterday, and I'm sure Jason will want to mention this, of the investigations that are taking place to see whether this spreads more quickly amongst younger people. And that would obviously have implications for education. But Jason might want to talk about that and other work that's being done. The science is moving forward. It can't go faster than the capability of doing so. For example, if you're going to grow a virus, you can't do it overnight. It doesn't take 10 minutes. But whenever that information is available, it is discussed with the First Minister, with the Health Secretary, with the Deputy First Minister, with the Cabinet. And the Cabinet will act, therefore, that's why we met on Saturday, which we don't often do, but we will meet as soon as we possibly can thereafter and try and come to a decision. But Jason needs to talk about the science.
So a couple of things, Ms Lennon. So the fundamental groupings are around human interaction. So that's work, education and leisure. I mean, you can fit almost everything into those categories. And each of those categories will have to play a part if that's what had to happen. They are already playing a significant part. None of those three categories are normal. So if it got to a point where we needed more, and if the R number increases by even 0.4, which is the lower end of the suggestion from NERVTAG, that means you need to get, in old money, you have to get to an R number of 0.5. And this new variant would take you to 0.9. Compared to the old variant. That is really, really difficult. So that would mean everybody working from home who possibly could. It would be back to March rather than November. Now, that also has implications for leisure. And when I say leisure, I mean places of worship. I mean gyms. I mean all the other things about retail, all those other elements. And then it also, of course, takes you into a conversation about education, which will have to include those in universities and colleges. That work is ongoing. The preparation for a variety of versions of university and college is already in train. They already have a staggered return ready. They have blended learning ready. They don't have blended learning for everybody planned, but if they had to, then they would revert to that, and we would only bring the practical courses back, like dentistry or motor mechanics or whatever has to be back. And schools have to be in that equation. The First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have both made that clear, both in the Chamber and in media interviews, that we will have to keep that under review. We have bought ourselves a little bit of time with the staggered return, and that will help us. But paying attention, of course, from a public health perspective, to the vulnerable children and those of key workers, which we will have to have in some kind of establishment that is safe and looks after their well-being. But all of those things have to be on the table. There is quite a lot of scare stories in the media around, is this more transmissible in children? We simply do not know. If it is more transmissible in 70-year-olds, it is probably proportionately more transmissible at all ages. That would make sense. But it is still very unlikely to transmit in 3- and 4-year-olds. But it may be that the percentage increases a bit in 16- and 17-year-olds, whose bodies are much more adult than the small children. So I would expect it to be more transmissible in older children as it's going to be in 30- and 40-year-olds.
Thank you, that's helpful. Convener, I don't think I'm going to have time for my questions, so I'm going to move on to something else briefly. I think, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned in your opening remarks some issues around enforcement difficulties, so maybe if you could expand on that very briefly. And a very practical question for the days ahead. Can I just get some clarity? You might have addressed this elsewhere, but I haven't heard it. Is there flexibility for key workers who will be working on Christmas Day to be able to see their families or other households indoors out with the 25th of December. Obviously at the moment we know that we're limited to one day, but what about people who have to work on Christmas Day?
Let me address that one first, because it applies also in another set of circumstances which I'm very familiar as an MSP for islands that are not excluded from Tier 4, and to which there are no ferries on Christmas Day. I'm sorry to say, and I am, and the First Minister made the point again yesterday when questioned on this very issue, I'm very sorry to say there are no exemptions to it. The problem with exemptions is the moment exemptions start to apply, then more and more people take those exemptions, and the effect of what we are trying to achieve is watered down. This is incredibly serious, and I know that people, and I've received lots of emails from people who are concerned, angry, frustrated by this, but there are no exemptions. We've gone down from the four days or 5 days that were in the original plan to 1 day. If we were to vary that any further, then we would simply create not just more confusion, but more opportunity for the virus to spread and the new variant to spread. So the answer is regrettably no there. And there's nothing I can say that softens that. That is just the situation. In terms of enforcement, I think the issue there is that there have been issues about stores, non-essential stores, which I think most people would accept are non-essential, opening. And I think because it is the outcome of this that is really important, and I go back to that point, the fact that movement and contact is reduced and severely curtailed, because that is how the virus spreads from human being to human being, then we have to look at the outcome we're trying to get and to make sure that we're doing the things that get to that outcome, commensurate with the ability to buy essential supplies, and therefore shopping becomes a matter of necessity, not, as some people find it, a matter of leisure, regrettably. And that is also why it is necessary to draw this more tightly. Some people, understandably, have been trying to get around it by saying, well, actually, we're an essential food store, or we're an essential store for this or that. And we've had to say, no, sorry, the definition of essential appeared to be too wide previously. It needs to be drawn more closely.
Thank you.
Please, can I turn next to Mark Ruskell?
Thanks, convener, and good morning to you both. Can I just go back on some comments you made there about the new variant? When do you think we'll have better knowledge about its transmissibility, particularly with children? I mean, Professor Leach, you were kind of speculating there about whether it's potentially more transmissible with older children compared to younger children. When do you think we'll actually have data on that? I gather that Public Health England might be coming out with a report next week.
Yeah, so daily we get as much as we can get. They will tend to publish on a bi-weekly or weekly basis if we get definitive news. But if they get something that happens to be today, they will publish today. Everybody is in as big a hurry as everybody else. The nature of this is we have to wait almost for the virus to transmit before we know if it went from the 13-year-old to the adult. So it requires quite a lot of work on the contact tracing and who got it where and how. So it's not instant. We can examine the actual virus microscopically, and we can work out what the spike protein looks like, and we can then work out why it might be more transmissible. Actually, how it behaves in the wild, if you'll forgive the shorthand, will take us a little bit more time. So Public Health England and Public Health Scotland together will, of course, publish as soon as they get that. That may be in the next few days. It may be into next week. NERVTAG will meet over Christmas. Nobody will take any time off. And NERVTAG, if it gets more information, will then publish its minutes again. I'm expecting them to meet later this week again.
Okay, thanks for that. And just in terms of the data around the prevalence of the new variant, you answered the convener's question earlier on about whether this forms part of the framework. But is that data available? Can we see by council area as a new variant starts to spread, where it's appearing and how it's infecting people?
Not yet, but Public Health Scotland are working on precisely that, and that will it will, I'm afraid, pretty quickly turn the country all the one colour. I mean, you might get different versions of course. It'll be bigger in one area than the other, but we expect it to become the dominant strain like it is everywhere else, because if it's more transmissible, that's inevitably what will happen. And I would expect even now that to look like most of it in Glasgow and Lanarkshire and Lothian, and then gradually spreading through the urban areas. And that's why the travel restrictions are so crucial, because we need people to restrict their travel, and Christmas is a risk to that. But we will absolutely publish that as soon as we have data enough to be able to do it. I go back to one thing I said earlier, is finding this definitively, this variant, is quite tricky scientifically. So you have to do the genomics to be sure, but the S gene dropout gives us a proxy measure for where we think this variant is. But there are other reasons for the S gene to drop away, not just this single variant. So we'd have to be cautious and not to scare the horses too much if we started to publish that data.
Okay, and as I understand it, one of the features of this new variant is that people remain infectious for longer. Presumably that might have an impact then on issues around self-isolation and the length of time that people would self-isolate, and indeed how they need to be supported when they're in self-isolation. What kind of thinking are you doing about that and the impact on that?
Yeah, so we don't know that. We think the disease is the same. We do think there might be a viral load issue, and that might be one of the ways in which it transmits a little bit more. So it might be you need less of the virus to get infected. That would be one of the ways a virus becomes more transmissible. It gets into your cells easier, divides quicker, and therefore you get the disease. Remember, the self-isolation is always 10 days or longer if you still have symptoms. Sometimes not in all the communication quite as much as it perhaps should be from me and from others. I mean, so if you still have symptoms, you shouldn't leave your self-isolation, particularly if you still have fever. So some of that is still incorporated into the instructions, and if people are unwell, they will know they're unwell. They won't be leaving. So presently, and I've got into the habit of saying the date when I say that. So on the 23rd of December, we don't expect to change the self-isolation rules as a result of this variant.
Okay. Can I just go back to education again and our preparedness to deal with whatever changes we have to make to keep the virus under control? You mentioned earlier on about the universities and colleges being prepared for different eventualities there. Would it not be more cautious right now to say and to issue guidance to the universities in particular that all teaching will be online rather than the kind of staggered approach that we've got right now? There's a new variant coming. We know that will have an impact, and to be honest, students will be looking now at whether they're taking accommodation contracts for the next year. Would it just be safer just to say that's it, all online teaching is now the default?
Regrettably, an equal and opposite reaction, and we have to accept there are some people for whom that will not be suitable and that will not be practical. I mean, we know that Jason has indicated that for certain types of courses. What I can assure you, Mr. Ruskell, is that there's very active consideration of what should take place. That has to happen between the universities and colleges and the Scottish Government, but there is no intention to delay any guidance or suggestion, but it is trying to make sure that everything is understood and we have enough information to say the decision that we're making is the right decision and cannot be challenged too. There are always people who will be prepared to challenge those decisions, and therefore the legal basis of that decision has to be very clear. So I hear what you're saying. Nobody is holding back, unable to make a decision. But what they're trying to do is to get the right decision communicated in the right way when it is agreed to, and that's what will happen.
Okay. And perhaps finally, if I could turn to schools. I mean, we're now at a position where there will be a closure of schools. apart from the most vulnerable children and those who are the children of essential key workers in the new year. Can I ask about the plans that were developed in the summer for online and blended learning? Are those still applicable in the situation where we have this new variant virus that's moving around? Are those ready to go? Are teachers ready to go? Are school staff ready to go on a much wider plan if you need it for online learning, extending way into the new year and potentially into February?
Well, I'm absolutely sure that John Swinney would be in a better position to answer that than I am. I mean, I know that the work that was done was extensive, therefore no such work is ever wasted, and therefore contingency plans will exist for those circumstances. But the detail of how that works and the detail of what each local authority has done and how it is being done at each school level, I think it really has to be for Mr. Swinney. Now, I'm happy to ensure that he briefs you and informs the committee at the earliest possible date. There are, of course, opportunities to question him too.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Can I next turn to Willie Coffey, please?
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could ask a question initially about some numbers to Professor Leach. Yesterday, Professor Leach, the number of positive cases was reported as 1,316. Only 4 days before that, it was 744, so it's nearly doubled in about 4 days or so. Is there any data telling you why that's happening? Is it attributable to the new strain of the virus, or is it just more infections occurring in the wider population?
Yeah, so we should be slightly cautious, Mr. Coffey, about comparing one day with another. But you are right in the sense that the numbers are increasing again. We think the 700 was an underestimate and the 1,300 was an overestimate, and it's about date of sample rather than date of report. So eventually, what we try and do is we publish what we know on the day we know it, but then the data gets better over time. Of course it does, because with date of sample is a much more reliable measure than date of report. So that 700 was a little bit low, and when it came through, I was suspicious. The 1,300 was a little bit high, and when you look at date of sample, it was catching up with some of the 700. So that explains the 600 difference. However, okay, the numbers are in general going upwards, and you saw that before we knew that the new variant was doing what we now think it is doing. So that appears to suggest the new variant may be playing a role. And in the southeast of England, London, for example, went from 150 per 100,000 to over 400 in 18 days. So they nearly trebled in 2 and a bit weeks. So something happened there. And that's why the scientists began to look, because they realised lockdown, as described there, wasn't doing what we thought it would do. Now, so far in Scotland, particularly Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Lanarkshire, have responded to level 4 measures, and that has gone down. Lothian, unfortunately, rising again, as you can see in some other places. So we think the new variant is probably interweaved in there somewhere, but not exponentially yet, which is why you see us giving the advice and then taking the measures we've taken on Boxing Day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You were saying earlier that this new strain transmits easier, faster. Is there any further advice that the public could embrace to protect themselves even more? I mean, is the guidance basically the same as it was before?
Yeah, so SAGE,
faster?
It's a very important question, Mr. Coffey. So SAGE are looking at precisely that. Remember, SAGE, NERVTAG is a subcommittee of SAGE, so SAGE is the big scientific advisory group that advises all of us about how we should do this. We have Scottish people in there. We have the best scientists in the country working on this. The present position on the 23rd of December is that the present non-pharmaceutical interventions are the right things to do. A cough is still a cough. A sneeze is still a sneeze. The new variant doesn't make it go further. So it's about staying away from that cough or sneeze or surface. So still not getting the virus is the same measures as you've been taking. So cut down your interactions, stay at home as much as you can, and if you do go out, follow those facts that now we know, the face coverings, the avoid crowded places, all of those things. Now, if we think, for example, and I'm not suggesting this is what we might do, but SAGE might say that the places that have been given an exemption to the 2 metre rule should now rethink that. That might be one of the things that Sage would eventually say. So the 1 metre plus in England, or the 1 metre we have in Scotland, that may be something, because the 1 metre is 2 to 10 times more likely to transmit the old virus. So that may be a problem with this new variant. That's not the position we're in just now. Sage will continue to look at the data as it comes out, and we will adjust what we call the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the public behaviours, as time passes, if we have to do that.
I wonder if I might just come in on the first question, because I was trying just to add something to it. I think, Mr. Coffey, that we've made clear, Jason and I, at previous meetings, and I want to make clear here now that nobody is saying one of two things: that there's something, we should abandon the levels approach. We're not saying that. I think that was a question raised in the Chamber yesterday, and the First Minister was very clear about that. But we're equally saying, and we're saying before last week, that the levels approach should be kept under constant review, and it would need fine-tuned. And therefore, there are issues of fine-tuning which will have nothing to do with the new variant, but which we need to keep developing. But also, it does illustrate another truism of this pandemic, I suppose of any pandemic, except we've not seen one, I've not seen one at close quarters before, which is that we have to constantly keep learning and keep learning things about how the virus changes, but we have to keep learning. And one of the things we learn is how the levels would operate, how they need to change, were the reasons, something that a number of us have been talking about for some time, the fact that the level 3 restrictions seem to take the figures down to a plateau, but that plateau then sticks. Was that to do with the new variant, or was it to do with something else within that? For example, issues of alcohol. So we don't know. So there's going to be a continued process of learning, and that will go on every day, every moment of every day, while we try and do the job we're setting out to do. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought it was important to say that.
No, that's always appreciated, Mike. My last query is probably for yourself, Mike. The most frequent complaint that I'm getting from constituents is about their experience in their supermarket or their retail store. People are saying to me quite clearly that there doesn't appear to be proper or much management of customers when they're in these buildings. Is there anything we can possibly do to try and tighten this up, to try and make people feel a bit more assured when they're inside a building with a lot of people in it, basically?
Well, there are 2 points I would make to this, Willie. The first of which is to say people are nervous, so they will be hypersensitive to what is going on around. And we're all nervous, but we're all worried about it. So I think there's perhaps an element of nervousness that comes into this now, and it's an extraordinary thing. None of us ever thought we'd be in that position, but we are. The second one is, yes, if there is evidence of supermarkets not operating the strictest set of policies, then we need to know and others need to know. Councils need to know for environmental health enforcement. There needs to be a recognition that we have got to, as a society, as communities, collectively say that doesn't work, that is not good enough. We need to do this properly, and to help each other to observe it. We should not be censorious to each other if we can avoid that. The 4 E's is a good rule for policing, but it's also for us too to say, this escalates, and let's start off by saying to people, explaining to people why we feel uncomfortable, what we need to do, why we need that to change, and to try and encourage people to change. So I'm not quoting Burns simply because you're an Ayrshire MSP, but so gently scan your brother man, still gentler sister woman, does not seem to me to be a bad bit of guidance at Christmas or any other part of the year. So let that happen. But if there is persistent offending in this, if there is laxness and carelessness which is deliberate, then that has to be stopped. And of course, we'll do that.
Thank you very much for that. Just very finally, on security of supply of the vaccine, Cabinet Secretary, is that still okay, given the problems that we're facing with flights coming and going into the UK?
Yes, the Health Secretary will give an update on this today. The vaccine programme is continuing as planned and going well. Quite clearly, the addition of another vaccine is going to help, and we hope that is not too far off. And we would intend to follow that programme as quickly and as promptly as we possibly can. I mean, there was a something very ludicrous in one of the questions yesterday about increasing it, in a certain way. We will do everything we possibly can to make sure that programme is delivered. It is being delivered, and if it could be delivered any more quickly, and it depended on the slide about the virus, it would be delivered because we're focused on it. There is no evidence that there's any disruption to that, and the plans exist to make sure that is prioritised above all other things.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Willie. Our next question comes from Liam MacArthur. And Liam, before you ask your question, if you have any relevant interest to declare, can you do so? Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. I would refer members to my register of interest, but I'm not aware of any interest that would be directly relevant to the work of the committee. Thanks very much, Convener. Thanks for your welcome. Good morning to Jason and to the Cabinet Secretary. Can I start actually by offering thanks to Jason Leach for his impromptu appearance at the Crossroads Orkney Christmas Zoom party, which I know has gone down exceptionally well. Maybe though, turning to the issue of testing, which we discussed very briefly in the briefing earlier this week. Obviously, Cabinet Secretary, you've referred to the commitment still to the tiered system. Orkney, Shetland, Western Isles have found themselves going from Tier 1 to Tier 3 in a one, and while there may be an understanding of the rationale behind that on a precautionary basis, there is still obviously a desire to see us return to level 1, if not level 0, as quickly as possible. And one of the options that's been, I think, voiced locally is the idea of testing at airports and at ferry ports, inbound and outbound, which wouldn't necessarily do away with the restrictions on the movement, but may then allow a degree more flexibility in terms of movement and activity within the islands themselves. And I just wonder whether there'd be a commitment from the Scottish Government with their advisors to look at that option in the run-up to the 18th of January. The First Minister seemed to at least be seeding the notion that these restrictions will be in place longer than that. But I think there's a real desire to explore any and all options that might allow a bit of additional leeway in areas where, as you'll be aware, Cabinet Secretary, there remain no cases in very low levels of risk, notwithstanding the concerns in relation to the new strain.
I mean, I'd like Jason to answer the questions on testing and the efficacy and science of testing. I would simply say I fully understand the concerns. I have representations made to me, as you know, because we've discussed this, you and I, from island groups who felt very similar concerns. I am mindful, for example, of the fact that the Faroes was completely free until there was an infection from an incoming, I think, fishing boat, but certainly a commercial boat, which was not rigorously tested. So there are always, regrettably, holes in whatever human system is put in place. I don't want to do two things. I don't want to give hope that the restrictions can be lifted in some easy way, because that is not true. Equally, I don't think we should ever be unreasonable in terms of thinking about solutions to problems that people have. So that's an equivocal answer, and I'm sorry to give you an equivocal answer, but I think it will arise out of the science of testing. It will also arise out of what progress we make as a nation in doing the task that we have set ourselves, which is the desperately needed task of making sure that our health services are not overwhelmed. So the balance will lie in there. What you're saying will be taken away and thought about, just as the proposals from other Scottish islands were. It took some time to get to that point, but I don't want to make people to think that this is going to happen quickly. Equally, I don't want people to think that we wouldn't think about possibilities. We're always thinking about possibilities, but I think they will be based on the science, and Jason should speak about the science.
So thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and Mr MacArthur, and you're very, very welcome for the engagement with Crossroads in Orkney. I look forward to a day when we can perhaps travel again to Orkney. I think there's something quite important about the islands being, let's call them, relatively virus-free just now. If they remain virus-free following the Christmas relaxation, I will be more relaxed. So the Christmas relaxation and the potential travel to those island communities from areas that have virus is what really worries us. So if that is kept to a minimum and the islands remain relatively virus-free following that period, I think then there will be an argument to look again at what the levels and restrictions should be in the island communities. That just makes perfect scientific sense. Your second point, which is about effectively test to do something, and that we're under huge pressure from pretty much every sector you can imagine to allow them to test to do something. So test to go to a football match, test to allow travel, test to go to an island, test to go to a pub. Unfortunately, the present testing isn't reliable enough to allow us often to say yes to that. You've seen in the last 48 hours what's going to happen with the Dover-Calais Strait, and testing to travel is going to be used there. It's going to be used there for the first time, and it will be very important that we monitor and learn from that science, particularly if those individuals are coming from high prevalence areas or low prevalence areas, and we will follow that up with data from Scottish drivers, from UK-wide drivers. So the present position is only by exception are we allowing testing to allow something, like, for instance, testing to allow more care home visiting, testing to allow people to do stuff. Eventually, I think that will become much more common because the testing will improve. We will get more reliable testing over time. The lateral flow tests will get better. We will get quicker, and they will be more reliable. For now, the testing is not reliable enough because it only finds the virus if you're shedding it. It doesn't find it in everybody. It doesn't find incubating virus. So to give people a test to allow them more permission to do stuff the rest of us are not allowed to do, we're not quite there yet.
Okay. I appreciate those responses. I mean, I think, as is acknowledged, we're seeing some of this at the moment in relation to what's happening in Kent. I know various airlines and Delta Airlines already deploy a similar approach. I appreciate it's not a guarantee and there are risks, but I think I would just make the plea that this is that the time between now and mid-January is used in part to explore this further. Just want to follow up very briefly on a couple of business-related issues. Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware that obviously the islands remain in level 3, whereas the rest of the country is level 4. The support available, particularly to tourism businesses as a result of that, may differ, and I think I would urge you to look with your cabinet colleagues at applying a similar eligibility criteria for bed and breakfast, self-catering, tourism businesses that in the islands will be affected as badly as those in level 4, even though they remain in level 3. And the other point I would urge you to look at in a preemptive way is the issue of supply chains. There's been much debate about that, but the islands obviously remain at the end of most, if not all, supply chains, and therefore some of the issues that we were seeing earlier in the pandemic, I think we're desperately keen to avoid a repeat of, should there be any squeeze on particular items. So, I would seek an assurance that is being looked at, as I say, in a preemptive way rather than waiting until we see problems emerging.
On both issues, I would fully understand what you're saying. I've experienced the same issues myself in my own area. On tourism, it is quite clear that a number of businesses, and this has been true at level 2 and level 1 as well, which were not forced to close as a result of those restrictions, have in actual fact lost all their business, because all their business was dependent upon people coming in from areas that were of higher prevalence. I think that is already being addressed by the Cabinet Secretary for Tourism and by local authorities, of course. The discretionary funds are one issue there, and those need to move as quickly as possible. I heard the Cabinet Secretary for Finance talking about this yesterday. We need to get that money out to people, and we need to make it clear that we understand that problem and that therefore there needs to be compensation. There is a wider issue of tourism recovery, which Fergus Ewing has addressed. New funding for that was announced, I think, was it last week or the week before? I think it was the week before that, and that money is in the process of getting into the system. It needs to get into the system quickly, and it needs to be applied to those businesses in your area, my area, and other areas, which essentially are not operating, not because they're shut, but because there is no business for them. So the point is taken. On the issue of supply chains, what we've seen in the last 48 hours has focused minds yet again on the vulnerability of all of us to the Short Straits crossing. The vast majority of fresh fruit and vegetables, for example, that come in at this time of the year from the Mediterranean, either from Spain or from North Africa, come via the Short Straits. And any interruption to the Short Straits has an effect, or will have an effect, quickly. We will see in the next week or so what takes place. I don't think there will be major shortages now that the problem is easing, though it's not been solved. There are major implications for people exporting, particularly shellfish and fish, and that is disastrous for them, utterly disastrous, utterly willful in terms of how the UK government has ignored that. But we have focused on the supply chains. We know those problems. We've been through them through 2 episodes of preparing for no deal. We have an assurance from the suppliers at every level that there will be an equity of supply, and that will mean that things do not simply, when you get to the end of the supply chain, there's nothing left. We saw during the initial lockdown some comparatively minor, although they were serious in the areas, comparatively minor problems with that, and also with the lack of understanding by some retailers of the increased demand that would arise when people cannot move, cannot go and shop elsewhere. That's an issue in the islands too, and I fully appreciate that. Very often people go and shop on the mainland, or they go and shop elsewhere. If they can't do that, then there's going to be a need for increased supply rather than putting the supplies at risk. All of those things are issues that are understood. All of them are part of the planning we're doing for consecutive risk, which we're looking at the moment, and concurrent risk that we're looking at the moment, and we'll keep those under review. And we're very aware that the vast majority of supply chains end either in the north of Scotland, the west of Scotland, or in Northern Ireland.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary, on that point you mentioned about
Liam, many apologies, but given the time constraints, if you could hold your question as a supplementary if we have time, but I'm going to have to move on. Apologies. Can I? Thank you. Can I ask Annabel Ewing, please?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues, and good morning again to the Cabinet Secretary and Professor Leach. My first question, really picking up, broadly speaking, from Liam MacArthur's question of supply and impacts on potential supply across the piece, though. I understand that yesterday the NHS Confederation wrote to the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson calling for an emergency extension of a month to take the NHS out of, and I quote, the immediate danger zone, and it will enable the NHS to continue to focus on fighting the pandemic without having to contend with disruptive changes. Could I ask, firstly, the Cabinet Secretary his thoughts on that call? Thank you.
I echo the call. I mean, the First Minister and I, 2 days ago, were urging the UK government to recognise that it was always foolish to pursue Brexit during a pandemic. That foolishness has been exacerbated by the inability to come to a conclusion, and the fact that we are now 8 days away and there is still no resolution, and that there should be a mechanism found, and human ingenuity can always find a mechanism, to at least provide a period of grace for the non-implementation of any changes at this very, very serious time, and particularly with the way that the pandemic is now worsened in recent days. Now, I have to say that, writing to the Prime Minister, which should be in any rational democracy, an action that is respected and paid attention to, particularly from the NHS Confederation or from any of the other organisations, which are a myriad of organisations, said this last week, what we actually have is, one tends to feel that you might as well put a letter in a bottle and throw it in the sea, because it will be paid, no attention will be paid. And we've just had nonsense back from the Prime Minister's spokespeople and from others, and the disdainful view of these opinions. And that is part of the course, but it is utterly shocking. We will continue to argue for that. And we will continue to argue for that type of pause, which is absolutely essential. And if the NHS can, as reams of others are asking for, in the name of God, listen.
Yes, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer, and obviously it's really dispiriting. I mean, what can you say to a Prime Minister that comes on a briefing and says there's, what was it, 167 lorries? I think there's 2,000 to 3,000 lorries. I mean, you know, we need to live our lives. People need to feel that, you know, there's no risk to the NHS, there's no risk to vaccine supply. And I know that the First Minister yesterday and yourself this morning, Cabinet Secretary, have reiterated your belief at the moment that there isn't going to be a shortage of vaccine supply vis-a-vis the Pfizer one coming from another country. But when we look at pictures of Kent, how can you give us that assurance, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I mean, you know, I want to be rigorous in telling the truth to people, and I want to be clear about what risks are. And at the very beginning, you know, of the first preparation for the first possibility of a no deal, which now seems ages and ages ago, 2 years ago, you know, we said we would do everything we could, but we couldn't do everything. You know, one of the areas in which there has been, you know, enormous work done right across the 4 countries has been on the provision of the virus. That's been, you know, a positive thing. And, you know, we work very hard, we all work very hard to make sure that that is not at risk. And equally, we work very hard on the issues of supplying medicines and medical devices, and will continue to do so. But we have seen the vulnerability of the system graphically demonstrated in the last 48 hours. You know, and it really does add insult to injury when we have a Prime Minister who stands up and says, against all the evidence, you know, that we will prosper mightily as a result of this. You know, we've just heard concerns about Orkney. We've just heard, you've seen all the concerns about those who are excluded, who are vulnerable. We know what we have seen with those lorries, I think he said 174 lorries. You know, at that stage, there were over 1,000. You know, there are thousands now. We saw that apocalyptic view of lorries driving in to park on an airfield. And there's a man standing there saying we're going to prosper mightily. It does not compute.
No, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Indeed, it does not. Turning to Professor Leach, sticking with vaccine, I think I heard on the radio this morning that former UK Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair has called, it appears, or is reported to have called for, in terms of the rollout of the Pfizer vaccine, for us to abandon the approach of the protocol accompanying that vaccine, which is that you need the second shot within 3 weeks. So to not give people the second shot, but to give yet other individuals one shot. Is this what he has called for? And how does this align with the medical protocol for this Pfizer vaccine, Professor Leach?
So I haven't looked at the detail of what Mr. Blair has said. Some of the reporting I've seen is actually quite sensible. It's basically go as fast as you can, as deep as you can, which is what we all want to do. I think one of the things that has been reported, I would have to look at what he actually said and who his advisors are and all of that. But one of the things appears to be let's try and not hold back the second doses in order to give more first doses. Now, in principle, that's correct if you can guarantee the second doses will arrive. And that's where our problem arises. So if we get, for example, 60,000 doses of the vaccine, that allows us to inject 60,000 people once or 30,000 people twice. Because we cannot guarantee that the Pfizer doses will come within 3 weeks, Pfizer and the MHRA, our regulator with whom we cannot depart, says hold the other 30,000 to make sure you can vaccinate those people fully. Because immunity happens in 2 bumps. You get a small bump from the first one, a big bump from the second one. So if we only give them 1 injection, they will not be protected from the disease enough. So until we know more about vaccine supply, then we have to do that. Now, I think that will resolve itself relatively soon. As we get more vaccines approved, we will get more supply, and this problem will become not a problem anymore. But for now, the MHRA are insisting that we hold back the second dose, and we have to do what the MHRA say. They are our drug regulator.
Thank you, Professor Leach, for that clarification. One very last brief question. The AstraZeneca vaccine, I understand the reports that India is hoping to approve this next week. Where do you think we are in the UK with the MHRA? And hopefully it is approved, what is the plan to proceed with a very quick rollout from the moment that the vaccine is approved? Professor Leach.
Well, hoping for approval either just this side of Christmas, which is now, or just after Christmas. So hoping for approval both from the MHRA, and then we need joint committee advice about how we should manage this particular vaccine. We don't expect that to be very different from the Pfizer one, apart from the storage issues, which don't apply to the AstraZeneca one. But they need to submit their data, they need to finish their phase 3 trials, they need to tell us it's safe and effective, both things, and then we are ready. Remember, we won't get 100 million doses on the 1st of January, we will get some tens of thousands of doses, and we are ready for that, and we have plans to ramp that up pretty quickly. Lots of people being trained. For instance, I heard yesterday hundreds of dentists have signed up for the vaccination training. That will give us a new army of vaccinators around the country, and we are ready for whatever supply we get. We've made some presumptions about supply based on conversations with the UK procurement and the companies. That's been published in the Parliament Library about what that will look like. If that comes quicker, we're ready, we can go quicker, and the quicker we can go, the quicker we'll protect the population. But we are entirely dependent on the factories making the vaccine, and they of course are limited. And we talked about this at the committee, I think last week, about the ethics of vaccination. We shouldn't have all of the world's vaccine in Scotland. That vaccine has to be distributed to other parts of the world, including India, which you describe, and other parts of the world that will not be able to afford what we can afford.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Leach, for that helpful information. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Annabel. Could I turn next, please, to Maurice Corrie?
Thank you, Convener. A couple of questions. The first question is for the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, we obviously in level 4 in Scotland means lockdown. What are the Scottish Government's plans for beefing up communications to emphasise protection rather than lockdown? In other words, to make people more conform to what was required to be done. Is there any new sort of ideas coming forward from your communications team?
Ideas from communications teams, that's what they're there for. I have to say that yes, we are continuing to promote the message very vigorously as the change takes place, and as the change is taking place, we are promoting that message very vigorously. We are looking also to the community leaders like yourself, Mr. Corrie, and others to be out there telling people what the situation is in their own area, and therefore I think it's really important that every MSP is familiar with what is on the website and the information there. If you go and look at the website, there's also some really interesting graphics and graphic, simple to understand graphic demonstrations of what the levels mean. We should be distributing those as much as we possibly can, and we'll go on doing so. So comms has been very important. I think the strength also is a simple message, which is the whole of Scotland, with the exception of the island authorities and a small group of Argyll Islands, and they know which they are at level 4, and that therefore everybody will be doing the same thing. And also stressing, as I've tried to stress today in my opening remarks, that we're tightening level 4. But again, it's outcome, and I just want to make that point, Mr. Corrie, very strongly. It's outcome we're looking for. If we understand that suppressing the virus is a #1 priority, and we have to do everything we can to do it, and that the virus spreads from one human being to another, then we have to say to people the outcome we're looking for is avoid that, avoid the potential for that transmission. And we all know how important that is.
Thank you, Cabinet. That's very clear. Thank you very much. My next question is for Professor Leach. Professor Leach, what would be the extra measures that you would think need to be taken for school teachers and classroom support staff from January, should we be faced with this new strain of the virus appearing in this nation?
So that's a tricky question to answer now with the knowledge we presently have. I'm relatively comfortable that we've got a bit of a gap now in order to get as much science as we can. As we said earlier, it appears that the present interventions, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the distancing, the hand washing, all of those things work as well for this virus, this variant, as they do for the standard variant. So that will stay in place. If SAGE or NERVTAG or our own advisory group in Scotland suggest we should do anything else about distancing or about areas that perhaps in secondary school need something else, we've already done the face coverings in older kids. The adults are distancing, but it may be that advice has to get more robust. If it does, then we will not hesitate to give that advice to the Deputy First Minister. We have an education advisory group who will now convene and look at their advice in relation to what we know about this new variant. That will not be a single point in time, of course. That will have to change over time. But I'm confident we have the mechanisms in place to get the best advice we can to that point. I cannot predict what that will look like on the 5th of January or the 18th of January, but I'm very hopeful that we would get that advice in place in time.
Following on, just quick, one final point, Professor Leach. Would you see, therefore, the adoption of regular testing of pupils and staff as part of that to combat the situation?
So I think we have to consider testing in the round as part of all of the mechanisms we're going to do around schools, universities, other places. I was going to say scepticism, it's not scepticism. My reticence to rely on testing still remains, just because it can only be part of the building block. It cannot replace some of these other elements. I don't see a world in which we're regularly testing children. There could be a coherent argument, and it's been made by unions and others, about regular testing of staff and adults. And if that's appropriate, and we have capacity, we will recommend it. The lateral flow testing, remember, even in the last few days, has come under quite a lot of pressure about its reliability, its sensitivity, what it can do, what it can't do. And we're back to Mr. MacArthur's question about can you do a test that allows you to do more than if you hadn't had the test? And that's a balanced judgment sometimes, and it'd be a balanced judgment about schools and about transport.
Thank you, Professor. That's very clear. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Maurice. Our next questions come from John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. A couple of points, if I can, for Jason Leach. On the BBC last night, they were suggesting that if we could get to 67% vaccinated by July, we would have herd immunity. Would you say that was slightly optimistic?
Oh, Mr. Mason, I imagine that was one scientist. So the range of numbers I hear from the virologists is somewhere between 65 and 85. And the new variant may suggest that needs to be higher. That makes sense. More transmission, you need more immunity. And the immunity, it's important, we haven't actually mentioned this, the immunity still seems to be conferred and deals with this new variant. We need to check that for absolute certain, but it appears to be true. In most cases, getting higher is better, of course. So 80% of the adult population, 85% of the adult population would be where we're targeting and heading and hoping to get to. So far, COVID vaccination is very popular, let me tell you. So those who have been offered it are turning up. So I would anticipate that continuing, and education, advertising, all the things we're doing, I hope will encourage people to do that. And the new variant probably does that no harm, adds a little bit of urgency to people seeking that vaccine when we finally get enough supply.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, on a different issue, there was an article in the Herald yesterday I was reading about the question of treating COVID. And I mean, he was talking about interferon and things, which was way over my head. But I mean, you have said in the past there was no real treatment for COVID. Can you say anything about that at the moment?
So we have the biggest COVID treatment trial in the world happening and led in the UK, partly in Edinburgh, partly in other English universities, called the Recovery Trial. Basically what it does is it brings people into the trial who have severe COVID. It allocates them to certain treatment arms. That's how we discovered dexamethasone helps in severe disease. It's how we discovered remdesivir probably doesn't, and how hydroxychloroquine definitely doesn't. And everything is in that game. So interferon is in that trial. Blood transfusion is in that trial. As new drugs become suggested, they go into that trial. So for now, we do have some treatments for serious high-end disease, dexamethasone. It definitely reduces mortality, reduces the severe disease. What we don't have is drugs that stop you progressing to severe disease. That's kind of what we're seeking. So if you're on day 10 of COVID and you've still got the cough and still got a bit of a fever, is there something we could do that would just turn that corner for you rather than progress you to hospital and intensive care? And unfortunately, in many of those individuals who progress like that, unfortunately to death. So that's where we really want the drugs. So the recovery trial is ongoing. It is including antibodies and interferon and all of those other things. And it's working very, very fast, but it can only work as fast as it can, of course. And we need the disease to help us with that. So for now, dexamethasone is our principal treatment for severe disease.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks very much. And my third and final question really, I think, is to the Cabinet Secretary. Following up from what Willie Coffey was saying earlier on and the question of enforcement, I mean, I take the point that we want to have, is it engagement, explaining, encouraging, and before we have enforcing. But I just wonder, Cabinet Secretary, I mean, for example, at football, again on Sunday, I think it was, at the Cup final, repeatedly football fans turning up in their hundreds. I think 2 were charged because they had flares. So, I mean, clearly the other 3 E's are not working. Are we really just saying that football fans can behave any way they want?
Absolutely not. But clearly, with respect, Mr. Mason, you can't say that the 4 E's are not working. You actually do see a very high level of compliance, and I think therefore that approach is working. But of course, if those people who have been engaged with, who have heard the explanation, who are being encouraged, still will not do that, then the rules will be enforced. And that is the situation. Now, I can't comment on particular instances, but I can say I see evidence even in my own constituency of that taking place. And that is what should take place. But, they are working, and we should persist with them. And as citizens, we should persist with them. Because it is our job. I mean, first of all, as I've said to Mr. Corrie, and I say to you as community leaders, we've got to explain to people why this is important. We've got to make sure that we engage with people about the issues so that if we are in a supermarket and there are people concerned, we are saying to them, look, here's the facts. And we have to encourage people. So we say to those people we see who perhaps are not observing it, look, here's an issue. This is why this is important. So they are working. We want more of them. There's a high level of compliance. We want that compliance to persist and to go up, and we've all got a role to play in it.
Okay, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, I don't think, in any of that. I mean, I fully take that on board and so on. But if I could just maybe have one final shot. I mean, the police, and I think that's been the whole thinking, is to encourage, and that's what we all want to do. But I just feel there's not been very many people charged, or taken firmer enforcement when there's been repeated house parties, when there's been the football, some of these kind of incidents.
If there is an instance of repeated house parties that you are aware of, you should be saying to the police and saying that that's there and asking why that has not been proceeded with. I know people come to MSPs and say so-and-so is breaching the law. Well, the issue is they have to be engaged with to start with. There's no point in sitting at home and tutting and say, gosh, that isn't that terrible. They have to be engaged with. So I'd encourage that engagement, and I encourage people to have a debate. But we want to make sure that we are explaining, because explanation, encouragement, and engagement prevent the difficulty of enforcement. But there is still enforcement, and there is enforcement taking place when it's necessary, and it should take place when it's necessary.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you, John. Can I turn next to Stuart McMillan, please?
Thank you, Convener. First question is to Professor Leach, which is regarding the vaccines. Can you tell me how many vaccines are scheduled to arrive into Scotland by the end of January, please?
I don't have exact numbers. In fact, I don't think we know exact numbers. So the public, I'll have to check, Mr. McMillan, and we'll of course get back to you. But I think the supply presumptions were in what we gave Spice about the planning. I'll check that for you and I'll let you know. The only thing I would add to that is those numbers are not reliable for the reasons we've just described. The AstraZeneca vaccine is presently not approved. So as things stand today, potentially no AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm not expecting that to be the case. I'm expecting it to be approved, but we cannot presume that will happen because the regulators need to do their thing. So we are expecting doses on an ongoing basis. Christmas and New Year won't interfere with this in any meaningful way, and then more in January. But I can't give you exact round numbers. I don't think anybody can, but we will as soon as we can.
Thank you. And the events of what we've been seeing down in Kent for the last few days, I take it, are they going to have an impact on the vaccines coming into Scotland?
We don't believe so. The interim Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, Alison Strath, has led on our behalf for months now all of the planning and mitigations for Brexit, not necessarily this version of events that's happened a little bit earlier than we were expecting, around vaccination, around essential drugs, and very, very importantly, and Mr Russell has had to learn this as well, radioisotopes, which are all made in Europe on our behalf for the whole of Europe, and then have to travel to Scotland for radiotherapy patients. All of those supply lines are intact. We have a number of mitigations in place in order to get us those things. The vaccines and radioisotopes are coming by air. The AstraZeneca vaccine is made in the UK, so getting it out would be more of a problem than getting it to us. But as far as we know, for now, the short straits just now don't affect our supply. We also have Brexit ready, let's call them supplies. We already knew that we would need more. We are now having to use them though, because some drugs haven't been able to get through, of course. So we are into our Brexit supply now.
But obviously, I'd imagine that.
I should point out, Mr. McMillan, that the work that's being done on concurrent risk, discuss these issues on a virtually daily basis. And the assurance I've given about the vaccine is the assurance right across government. What we've seen at the short straits is definitely a problem. It has been a bigger problem going out for goods going out as goods coming in. In fact, bigger problem for goods going out at the present moment. But of course, some lorries go out and come back, and that is an issue in terms of subsequent supply. But the concurrent risks work has alerted us to that. There are some things that we cannot do, but we are confident about the vaccine. And as Jason has said, in terms of medical supplies and consumables, we've done an awful lot of planning on that over the last few years. So the stockpile is there. We are eating into it, but we're also replenishing it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Just a question regarding international flights. Obviously, notwithstanding the fact that some 40 countries or so have banned flights from the UK going into their countries, and the fact that also now there is this other strain, which is 70% more transmissible, and also notwithstanding the fact that many of these powers don't lie in the Scottish Parliament, they're still reserved to Westminster. Is there now a stronger argument to have a stronger set of testing at airports when people arrive, or potentially stop more flights from leaving UK airports going elsewhere, and also vice versa, to protect the population in Scotland?
Well, I'll let Jason answer the testing issue, but can I say the default advice remains stronger than ever: do not travel. That's just the advice. There are, of course, circumstances in which people have to travel, either urgent work circumstances or compassionate circumstances. We all, as constituent MSPs, deal with those. But the advice, the strong advice, the firm advice is do not travel. And therefore, we are trying to make sure that people are not coming in or going out by air or any other means. And of course, the movement within these islands is now severely restricted. And rightly so. And of course, Ireland, as I indicated in my opening statement, has gone up to its level 5. So there is not internal travel within these islands. There should not be travel in and out of these islands at the present moment. Jason might want to talk about airport testing.
I think Mr Russell has outlined the position very well. The public health advice here is pretty straightforward, although, of course, very hard to implement. And it is based on the genomic study 3 weeks ago, which reinforced what we already knew about high prevalence to low prevalence. If you get the virus down to single figures, as we did in June, the only way it can get back in is if it travels in. It's the only route it has. And it travels with you as a human being, and you don't know you have it. I know I keep saying it, but everybody gets surprised when they get this positive diagnosis. So you are incubating the virus, and you travel to anywhere, you take the virus with you, whether that's to Scotland or Nigeria. So if you can get the prevalence down, you have to then restrict travel to stop it coming back until we get the world vaccinated in a way where we can then begin to return to what was our normal then. Testing at ports of entry, whether that's airports or Dover, can be part of the mechanism by which you could make that safer, but it is not a replacement for quarantine. It's not a replacement for holding people, particularly from high prevalence areas, whether that's inside Scotland or across a border, whichever border you wish to presume. Then testing may well be part of that, but we're back to our conversation again about whether testing to do something is legitimate at this point. And certainly for leisure travel, it is not. In the future, it may well become part of the armamentarium for leisure travel, as may vaccines. All of those elements, I think, will come over time. But for now, Mr. Russell is correct. No overseas travel unless it's absolutely essential.
Is there an argument to actually strengthen the quarantine measures in Scotland and also across the UK for when people actually do fly in, whether they have to do it or not?
So there is kept under constant review at UK level with our input, and then we make choices. Mr. Youssef gets advice every Wednesday night from Gregor and I about which countries, where, and what, and that is kept. That general position is kept under review. Then the more, let's call it the higher level advice about what that quarantine should be, whether it should be 14 days or 10 days, and whether it should be in quarantine hotels, that is separately kept under review. We haven't felt the need to change that, but the new variant puts everything on the table, and the more we learn, the more we worry about travel. It's as simple as that. And you've heard me say it a number of times over the last few weeks at this committee, that particularly if lockdown in the next few weeks works for us, that we will have to think very, very carefully about what we do with travel restrictions, because it will be the only way the virus can get back in. Mr. MacArthur's question about Orkney is exactly the same with a different set of borders. So if Orkney stays low after Christmas, the only way you can keep it low is not let the virus in.
No, thank you. And my final short question is that just regarding this new virus, and also the new strain of the virus. It seems to have been first reported on the 15th of December, and then on the 19th of December, obviously more information came out, and the announcement regarding the change of levels in Scotland for everyone, all the mainland, to go to Tier 4. Was there a particular reason why there was this gap of 3 days or so before this decision was taken? Was it just to build up more information and more understanding about the virus, or was there any other reason?
Jason Reitz would have to answer that. I'm unaware of it.
So it's to do with the science. It's NervTag. So we waited for NervTag to meet on Friday. So this variant of the virus, the genetic code for this virus, has existed for longer than the 15th of December. But remember, there are 300 variants. Well, what happened was this variant became the dominant variant over time in London, and lockdown didn't appear to be working. So everybody then pays attention, has a look, what's this dominant variant about? Let's have a look at it in amongst all the other variants and our genomic classifications. Then we start to pay attention. Gregor and I had information last Monday. So earlier last week, what day is this? This is Wednesday. So last Monday, we then tell the First Minister Monday night. Cabinet discusses it Tuesday for the first time. We tell the First Minister tells the country on Tuesday the new variant exists. The new variant is a worry. We have X number of cases in Scotland. Then as the week goes on, we get more. NervTag meets on Friday. The minutes of NervTag, we have Scottish people at NervTag. NervTag then reports to Gregor and I. We then tell the First Minister Friday night, emergency cabinet Saturday. So it's scientifically pretty quick, which is one of the reasons why we don't have all the answers to all the questions we're now being asked, because we've acted I hope, preventatively in order for us to do that. So this viral strain existed previously, small numbers, no indication it was any different or any worse, but gradually that became apparent that something different was happening. NERVTAG meets, we act.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. If we have time very quickly for Liam MacArthur's supplementary, can I ask the question and the answers to be as brief as possible? Thank you.
Thanks very much for squeezing me in, convener. It was just following up your comment earlier on, Cabinet Secretary, about the impact of what was happening in the narrow straits, particularly on the seafood sector in Scotland. I was just wondering, while we're seeing an easing of that, hopefully, what discussions have taken place with the UK government about compensating those who will undoubtedly have been affected in terms of loss of product?
The First Minister raised the issue of compensation at Cobra 2 days ago. They seem to be brushed off. I think the Transport Secretary indicated, the UK Transport Secretary, something about insurance, though as far as we're concerned, that's not an option. We are looking very urgently at our own ability to support the companies most at risk, and obviously we'll pursue that. And I know Fergus Ewing was tasked on I too find difficulty with the days now, but I think was tasked on Monday to come forward with something as quickly as he could, try and help. And I noticed, for example, one of the lead producers in my own constituency out in the lorry at 2 o'clock this morning, trying to deliver to UK customers to see if he could get more product into the domestic market. That's very hard, but people are doing a lot of work.
Thank you, convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we now move to the second agenda item, which is consideration of a motion on the subordinate legislation that we have just taken evidence on? Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make any further remarks on SSI 2020-452 before we take the motion?
No.
I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23775 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment Number 8 Regulations 2020 SSI 2020-452 be approved.
Moved.
Does any member wish to speak on the motion? And if so, could you please indicate this by typing R in the chat bar? No member wishes to speak, so I will now put the question on the motion. The question is that the motion S5M 23775 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? And if so, please type N in the chat bar now. No member has typed N, so the motion is agreed to. Can I state that the committee will publish a report to the Parliament setting out our decision on the statutory instrument considered at this meeting later today? That concludes our consideration of this agenda item and our time with both the Cabinet Secretary and the National Clinical Director. And can I thank you both for their attendance, for your attendance this meeting, and can I now close the meeting? Thank you.